This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hi.
Hey,
Hey.
how are you?
Okay. A little, I don't know what's the word for the way that we feel right now. There's just like a low level
Looming
dread and anxiety happening.
worry.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the world at this moment. A lot
It's
of which
heavy.
the world is heavy. A lot of it deserves attention. We're going to try in our own little way to cover some of these things. But first, just a little reminder for our listeners, who are you?
Who am I?
Yeah, who
I'm
are you?
Katie. Who are you?
I'm Chelsea. And this is 16 to 1.
A podcast all about teaching, learning, and education.
Yep.
So this week we used, the basis of our podcast, and we chose a story to tell, and it's that of Ruby Bridges
Yeah.
and all of the court cases that sort of led the way, paved the way.
Yep. We're trying to do a little bit of self-education about the history of what's going on in the United States right now.
Yeah. First of all, I think we just have to admit that, we as white people, we have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work.
And we need to be open and willing to learn and to sort of change these things about us that we're sort of just inherently benefiting from because we are white. And that's part of our privilege. And so Chelsea and I hope that by telling this story and by covering these court cases, that we can sort of help amplify voices that need help right now, to make sure that they have the space that they need to tell their story, and to ensure that we're doing what we can to be better allies for people who aren't as privileged as we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of the education we're doing for ourselves is, I guess I think it's important, especially for white people, to not forget the history of the issues that we're seeing now in the United States. And I think a lot of it sort of is easily forgotten. You learn about some of this stuff in high school or middle school, and then maybe you choose a profession where you need to learn about it in college. But after a certain point, for most white Americans, you kind of just put that stuff in a drawer, use it to answer Jeopardy questions. But a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about are still extremely relevant to the lived experiences of Black people in America today. So we're going to try to, just for our own sakes, make sure that history is not forgotten and that the history of these current issues is talked about in the context of what's going on in the country right now. So because our podcast covers issues of schools and education, like Kate said, we're using the story of Ruby Bridges as a way into what's going on now, as a way to kind of process things and for us to do our own learning. You have a note in our show notes here that says this stuff is less than 60 years old. So here we are.
Yeah.
A lot of this is way more recent history than many folks might know or want to believe or be reminded of right now.
I mean, we're talking about people our parents' age remembering and knowing of this stuff because it was happening in real time for them.
Right.
So we are not so far removed. I think that's one of the things that I always hear about especially when the conversation of the Civil War happens. For Americans, the Civil War seems so far away, but it was 1861, 1865. We're not that far away from less than 200 years from some of this stuff. So as far as America goes, we've got some room to grow. We still got work to do. Mm-hmm. And it's just part of that ongoing conversation.
Yeah. So all of that said, we're all ears. We're open to continuing to learn and continuing to try to do whatever small part we can do in dismantling systemic factors of racism that still exist in this country. I'm going to just go ahead and say, we've said this before when we've talked about kind of controversial issues on the podcast, but we're not unbiased. We're not approaching this issue from an unbiased point of view. We have a bias, and that's kind of an important thing to acknowledge for everyone listening who is directly participating in, or maybe is just an observer of the Black Lives Matter movement that's kind of going on in the country right now. Nobody is an unbiased observer. Everybody has some sort of bias that they're bringing to the table when they're dealing with these issues. So we just kind of want to be open about ours. We're in a position of privilege, but we want to learn. We want to address issues of racism that are still active and occurring in this country. And we think it's important to lend our support to people who are oppressed. So,
and not only in the vein of like education either. Like, I mean, we're coming, this podcast is coming from a place of education and teaching and learning, but as an educator, these things are really important right now, especially. Right. But as people too, like, it's not just that because I'm a teacher, I should do this or believe whatever. But like, also like as humans, we have to.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me and in the context of this podcast, this issue is really, so the story we're going to cover this week is really important because not everyone was afforded, until really kind of recently in the history of this country, not everyone was afforded an equal chance at a good public education. And so the things that we take for granted, the kind of basis of our lives out in the world of a public education, is not a thing that was available to everyone. And it's still not in many cases. I guess it just, like you're saying, this stuff, although we're talking about it in the context of schools, does form the foundation of kind of life, everything that happens. So anyway, we just want to make a note that we're not, this might be a little hard to process for some listeners for various reasons, but we're not going to try to even pretend to be objective participants in this discussion that's happening right now in this country, because we're riled up about it, and I think we should be. But just so our listeners know, we're not going to try to, hide behind anything or mask the way we feel about it. So
if you'd like to hear more, keep listening.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about this book a little bit later, but Kate and I just finished reading White Fragility, which is a pretty interesting book addressing why it is often incredibly difficult for white people to talk about and confront their own participation in racism in this country. But one of the things that was a main takeaway from reading that book was that there's really kind of no such thing as unbiased or judgment-free humanity. Everyone has biases and everyone makes judgments. And as much as we might try to teach people or teach our kids or whatever to be judgment-free and without bias, that's not actually humanly possible. We all have biases and we all make judgments. We're more and less conscious of them at different times, but they are there and they exist. And only when you recognize that they are there can you address them and learn to be more fair in the judgments that you make and the biases that you have. So just a general content note that we're not going to pretend to be unbiased throughout this conversation, and it is a difficult one, and we're probably going to get some things wrong, but we're going to try to get them right. So anyway, shall we begin our discussion?
Ruby Bridges was one of the 6 Black students who were chosen to attend and help to desegregate the white schools in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the beginning of the 1960s.
Right. So
I'll get into a little bit more about what exactly happened and sort of how she was chosen as one of them. But Ruby is sort of the figure for this desegregation in the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but most famously because of probably the Norman Rockwell painting of her. But she's sort of like the face of desegregation as it goes, because she was this adorable little Black girl who was being escorted to school by 4 U.S. Marshals every day.
Right.
So
I think most of us probably know of her from a couple of lines in our textbooks about the civil rights era.
Yeah. And they don't tell it very accurately either.
They probably don't tell it accurately. They don't tell it very completely. They use it as a kind of feel-good note about
there's definitely a white lens to it.
Yeah,
as far as
I would say that is a fair assessment, that there's a kind of, if not completely whitewashing, then at least a white lens in many textbooks, at least the ones that I can remember. And we'll talk about this, but the textbook that I remember was just sort of like Ruby Bridges desegregated schools, end of story.
Yay, Ruby.
But we're going to talk a little more about the specifics of how difficult that was. Right. But before we get into that story, I want to spend a little time looking at the legal background of this situation that she found herself in, because it's complicated and gross and there's a lot going on. I love reading Supreme Court cases, but a lot of them are, when you start to do that, you kind of dive into the ones that are really quite bad decisions, just really awful decisions. And a lot of those do have to do with civil rights related issues. So just to dive in, well, one of probably the worst Supreme Court decision of all time, kind of legal scholars probably agree on that, was the Dred Scott decision in 1857. So this was about an enslaved black man whose owners took him from Missouri, as a slaveholding state, into the Missouri Territory, most of which had been designated free by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That's another thing that you learn about in your textbooks and then never remember again. So his owners brought him back to Missouri later, and then Scott sued in court for his freedom because he'd been taken into a free territory. And so he's like, okay, well, legally, I'm free now. I am free now. So the state, he's suing for his own freedom, essentially. And it gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And then in 1857, in a 7-2 decision against Dred Scott, the Supreme Court ruled that Black people are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and therefore can claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States.
Yikes.
I almost have no words, but I'm going to keep talking anyway. So this opinion, the majority opinion, is written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, who is just the worst. So because the court ruled that Scott was not an American citizen, any federal lawsuit that he filed automatically failed because he could never establish the diversity of citizenship that Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution requires for a U.S. federal court to be able to exercise jurisdiction over the case. So what that's saying is essentially you don't have standing to sue.
You can't actually sue because you are not,
They essentially invalidated the entire process by saying you don't have citizenship, so this entire process doesn't belong to you. It's essentially saying this justice system does not provide justice to you because you are Black and therefore
not a citizen as granted by.
I just can't.
Like, covered in the protection of this.
It makes me so mad. But
that's a rough one.
Anyway, so that's probably the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. Taney, the Chief Justice at the time, continued to mess around and cause chaos, and he struck down the entire Missouri Compromise eventually as a limitation on slavery. So his whole claim was this weird procedural thing that it exceeds the constitutional powers of Congress, are exceeded by some of these things like the Missouri Compromise. So he's using these weird legalistic kind of language and avenues to essentially destroy the citizenship rights of Black people in America. So that's a nice starting point.
Yikes.
That's a horrible starting point.
Oh.
And okay, so the next major kind of Supreme Court issue that has to do with the history of Ruby Bridges is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It's sometimes called the Enforcement Act. It's a federal law enacted during Reconstruction. It's to try to ameliorate some of these issues that obviously were they're trying to grant rights to Black people in the United States. So that happens in 1875. The Civil Rights Act is passed. But then almost immediately after that, in 1883, there were these Supreme Court things called the Civil Rights cases. And it's a collection of 5 cases that came before the Supreme Court, ended up holding that the 13th and 14th Amendments did not empower Congress to outlaw racial discrimination by private individuals. So they're like, okay, this is fine as long as we're talking about public institutions or whatever, but we can't. This is at the time what they ruled in the civil rights cases, 1883. They at the time ruled that Congress is not afforded control over private persons or corporations under the Equal Protection Clause, which is crazy, but here we are. We're still litigating these kinds of things today. So this is not really that far from what we're still dealing with in this country. But so essentially a lot of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, a lot of the provisions of that were overturned by the civil rights cases in 1883. Then we get to probably the second worst Supreme Court decision of all time, Plessy versus Ferguson, another one that makes its way into our textbooks.
Briefly.
It's a landmark decision of the Supreme Court that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality, separate but equal. That's where that terminology comes from. So it's essentially saying, yeah, sure, you can segregate as long as you provide
This is so upsetting.
equal facilities, whatever that is supposed to mean. You can have things be segregated. Sure, why not? Pretty terrible.
Yeah.
I can't decide whether I actually think that Dred Scott or this one is worse, because they're both very, very bad.
I think Dred Scott rings differently for some reason. And
Yeah.
I think it's because it's about him personally and the denial of
I guess I mean,
citizenship just by, you know what I
right.
mean?
To me,
I mean,
they're both.
I'm not taking a stand for Plessy
Sure.
versus Ferguson, but
Well, I guess
it
I shouldn't.
feels, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't try to say that they're both equally bad, but they both completely strip citizenship rights
Yes.
of black people. So
Right.
it's one is about slavery, which is perhaps inherently worse, but the other is about okay, well, even if slavery doesn't exist, you're not going to have any of the rights afforded under the law.
Right.
So it's separate but equal. It sounds like it is better somehow in the minds of people at the time, but it's not. It's not better because.
No.
And because why we're going to learn in Brown versus Board, which is a very important court case that has everything to do with the Ruby Bridges story. So Brown v. Board.
But all of these things have sort of built up to this is where we're getting, like,
Right.
as far as like talking about some of these, like Brown versus Board is what allows the desegregation to start. So, but these things play a factor, obviously.
Right,
but...
right. So yeah, the history of all of that was to lead up to what eventually starts to overturn some of these really horrible decisions. And they have to be overturned so that the Equal Protection Clause, for some reason, completely baffles the Supreme Court. They just don't understand how to make things actually equal. So eventually things are overturned.
Just do what it says.
Yeah,
Nope.
I just, they find every way to not do what the Equal Protection Clause was intended to do. But they eventually overturn some of these things by way of the Commerce Clause, which is really interesting. But anyway, we don't need to go into a whole legal battle over what all of that means. But the important thing is we end up, after all of these cases and civil rights violations, at Brown versus Board. This is argued by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Education Fund. This gets struck down in the U.S. District Court, and then it goes on to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's an uphill battle all the way. The case comes before the Supreme Court in 1952. 1952.
Yeah.
Not that long ago. 1952. So the court consolidates 5 cases under this one name of Brown versus Board.
Right. They were all doing the same thing.
Right. They're all doing more or less the same thing. So Thurgood Marshall personally argues this case in front of the Supreme Court. He raises a variety of legal issues on this appeal, but the most common one was that separate school systems for blacks and whites were inherently unequal, and that therefore they violate the Equal Protection Clause. Okay, so I take back what I said earlier. This particular case was argued on the Equal Protection Clause, but a lot of the other stuff that's overturned later is overturned with the Commerce Clause. But anyway, so at first, when these arguments are heard, the Supreme Court can't come to a decision by the end of their term, so they rehear the case later in the year of 1953, and then in the intervening time, Chief Justice Fred Vinson dies and is replaced by Earl Warren. He's able to bring the court to a unanimous ruling on May 14th of 1954. He states the opinion of the court is that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
I just wish that's a room you want to be in. To see it go from, what was it at first? It wasn't unanimous, right?
I don't even know exactly why they couldn't come to a decision before, but it ends up being unanimous.
I know, isn't that just so fascinating that whatever happened, right, either politically or whatever, culturally, whatever was happening was enough, or the arguments got better, who knows which, to go from that, that's to a unanimous ruling. That's not easy.
Yeah. I think I do want to say, though, that there's still kind of a problem with even this unanimous ruling, and that's that it doesn't have teeth, really.
Well, it doesn't. I guess I'm more just impressed that it went from...
No, totally. It is interesting. I wish I knew what was going on in the deliberations in that time period.
I mean.
But
I would have just loved to have heard.
Right. So like I said, it doesn't have teeth because it's okay, they've said this, separate is inherently unequal. now what?
Yeah.
So there are more hearings concerning desegregation, and on May 31st, 1955, justices hand down a plan for how desegregation is supposed to proceed, and they say it's supposed to go with all deliberate speed. Which, what the heck does that mean?
That's not anything, really. That's just them saying, do it eventually.
So it's going to be years before all segregated school systems are desegregated. This court case, the second one, it's called Brown 2, is responsible for getting the process underway. Mm-hmm. So the story of Ruby Bridges that we're going to hear, is the direct result of this order of the Supreme Court to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed. Mm-hmm. Before we want to move into Ruby Bridges, I just wanted to kind of note a little bit of a fun fact about Annapolis, where I've lived for a while. In a completely incomprehensible move around the Annapolis State House, there used to be two statues. One was of Roger Taney, the Chief Justice responsible for the horrible Dred Scott decision. There was a statue to this guy erected outside the Maryland State House because, I don't know, he's from Maryland, and I guess we feel like we need to commemorate him for being so awful. I'm not sure. But so there was a statue of Roger Taney there until it was taken down and hidden away in 2017. And then the other statue on the opposite side of the State House was of Thurgood Marshall, Brown v. Board fame. So it just kind of goes to show the really weird and complicated history of these issues in the United States that we can somehow... I don't know how, this Capitol didn't burst into flame because of the fact that we decided to put these two completely polar opposite figures. Yeah, these two opposite forces in the civil rights movement essentially both had statues.
Well, the United States likes statues.
Yeah, we sure do.
And we like them of people that don't deserve them, especially.
It seems that we do.
So,
but we finally
in
2017 took down Roger Taney's statue, and thank goodness, because Dred Scott decision was horrible. Okay, so anyway, moving on, Ruby Bridges.
So that takes us to Ruby Bridges. And so Ruby was born September 8th of 1954. And I normally don't really feel that these things are that important, but this is important because Ruby is only 65 today. And so we are talking about when she, this little girl, but a little girl who are our parents' age, or, for listeners, in that range. So she's originally from Tylertown, Mississippi, but her family quickly moves to New Orleans. And so what happens is that after Ruby's kindergarten year, in an effort to start desegregating the schools, they have the Black students take a test, like a placement test, essentially, to see if their learning is on par with their, the white students in those schools. And so Ruby is...
Yeah, I'm just shaking my head, sorry, because it just frustrates me that not only do we have to force schools to desegregate, but they are also like, okay, well, yeah, but take a test first.
Right, and when we're talking about separate but equal, like, shouldn't the assumption have been that their school is just as, strong performing or whatever, and that she would be just as ready to come in and whatever?
If we're following the letter of the law of the Constitution and separate but equal...
You shouldn't have to take a test.
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Yeah.
There should be no reason to test a student from a Black school going to a white school because they're equal, right? Mm-hmm. Well, no. The educators in her school didn't think so they made her take a test, and she placed into William Frantz Elementary in the first grade.
So there were only, like I said, there were 6 Black students who passed the exam to start attending in this desegregation of the white schools. 2 of them didn't leave their original school. 3 of them went to a different elementary, and that left Ruby all alone as the only Black student at William Frantz Elementary for first grade. As this was happening, her dad really didn't want her to go, but her mom was very adamant that she would go get this education. And so that year, she actually didn't even start going to school until November 14th of 1960 because the district was essentially just dragging their feet on her attending. So this is where the history and the story, that like how we're taught it, kind of, diverge. Ruby, as she attends this school, is the only first grader in her class. She is taught by a teacher. I'll talk about Mrs. Henry briefly. But she spends her entire day alone in a school, eating alone, only playing with her teacher. That's it. There are no other students, not even other black students, because she was the only one at that elementary school for her to be at school with. So she did first grade all by herself, one-on-one.
But and again, so completely alone. Like white
Yes.
parents came to this school
The day that they arrived.
en masse, entered the school, took all of their kids
home.
out of school.
Yes.
So it's not even just like she was apart from the rest of her class. She was the singular person there. So the school was just completely empty most of the time, except for maybe I think there were like four other students.
There were a few other students, and there were a few others, but she might see them like walk by or play.
She passes them in the hall.
Yeah, it was just in passing. It was not right.
So it wasn't just that, okay, Ruby Bridges has to desegregate the school. It's that this little black girl comes to school and everyone else leaves in a kind of violent crowd of yelling and screaming at her, and she's 6. So
yeah, and so her mom walked her to school every day, and every single day she was escorted by 4 U.S. Marshals just to go to school. And so as part of the research, we listened to a few interviews of Ruby, and I've read obviously now a ton about her, but one of the stories, like sort of her understanding, you know, as a 6-year-old, let's say, if you're in first grade, you wouldn't totally understand sort of the big picture things that are happening around you. And so she said that she didn't really know to be scared until one day she saw someone holding a baby coffin, and in the baby coffin was a black baby, essentially like a doll.
Right. One of the people protesting.
Yeah, it was one of the people
at
school. Yeah. And so she said like that was a moment where it finally kind of struck her that it was her that they were yelling at, and that was kind of the problem. The Bridges family, though, even though they felt really fortunate that their daughter had this educational opportunity, like they suffered greatly for it. Her dad lost his job. There were grocery stores that refused to like let her mom come in and shop. Her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm where they had been for a very long time. But to hear Ruby knows that these things all happened, and like her parents did divorce. But Ruby does remember community people, both black and white, helping them. And so even when her dad lost her job, she remembers people trying to help him to get a new job. And she remembers the people who helped her mom by babysitting her and her siblings. And so to hear Ruby tell the story, she does remember the helpers, it seems. So while all of these things did kind of come down at them for her doing this, Ruby's perspective is that there were both black and white people who stepped up to help to make sure that she was offered this opportunity that she had so rightfully earned. So her teacher is a woman named Barbara Henry. She's from Boston originally. She had been working as a teacher on an Air Force base in France where she met her husband, and so they moved to New Orleans together. And that's what put her basically in this city to get this job. So she got a call asking about doing this, and she, even though she knew it was going to be for black students, she was absolutely willing and was even, to hear her tell, excited for this opportunity. And so Ruby and Mrs. Henry spent the whole year together, just the two of them, and they actually got to reunite later in life for a special on Oprah. And so after that, they even did some speaking engagements together. And so their story, like to hear Mrs. Henry, I listened to an interview with her. She was just like, I had already been teaching all kinds of people. It wasn't, like as a teaching in the Air Force bases, like you would have all types of students. So for her, it made no sense for why she wouldn't have accepted the job. And so she was even excited for the opportunity. But she received quite a bit of backlash as well, because then everyone knew who she was, obviously, because she was the teacher willing to teach Ruby.
Right.
And so to hear Mrs. Henry talk about Ruby, it's just an absolute love story. They just had the great, as good of a time as they could have. And Ruby says that she always felt like Mrs. Henry was trying to distract her to make her feel like, the stuff outside wasn't what was going on inside. Yeah. And so Mrs. Henry made a really safe place for Ruby to learn that year.
Ruby, in various interviews, has just expressed that she really enjoyed that education that Barbara Henry provided for her. But even then, it just still kind of blows my mind to imagine. It's essentially private tutoring at this point. It functions the same way because it's just Ruby and her teacher in the very in this classroom all day, every day
Yeah.
for the entire year, that first year of desegregation. And I mean, again, I just keep trying to remind myself that this is a 6-year-old girl. This is a girl who, when she showed up at school and saw all the protests, she thought it was Mardi Gras because
she was in New Orleans.
She thought it was a Mardi Gras parade. She's like, oh, all these people are out on the street yelling and screaming. It must be Mardi Gras.
That was the only thing she ever thought of.
Before she gets to I remember in an interview with her, she was telling a story of how at some point during the year, one of like the 4 white children or whatever, I think it was only 4, but one of these white children comes up to her at the hall at some point and says, my parents say I can't play with you because you're an N-word. And that's when she kind of finally, as a 6-year-old, even starts to realize, oh, this is about me. But it's just like, how do you process all of this as a 6-year-old? So
they did have a child psychiatrist involved. His name was Robert Coles, and he had studied, from what I understand, and worked with Harvard. And so he volunteered to provide counseling to Bridges, like to Ruby, for her first year while she was at the France Elementary School. And so he met with her in her home, and actually in 1995, he put together a children's book about her as a way to sort of tell her story in a way that was consumable for little kids. And so Coles, the psychiatrist, he donated all of the royalties from that to her foundation to make sure that it would give money for school supplies and other educational needs for impoverished New Orleans school children.
The Ruby Bridges Foundation.
Yeah. So she actually, one of the things that Ruby talked about was how in the Norman Rockwell painting, and if you've seen pictures of her going to school, how the clothes that she were wearing were like immaculate. And so she knew that her family couldn't have afforded outfits like that, but there was Cole's family had actually given her mom those outfits for her to wear to school, and they were just the cutest little dresses and shirt. I mean, she just looked adorable. I mean, she's 6, so she's precious, but his family had actually given her the clothes to send her to school because her parents could have never have given her outfits like that. And so we see people kind of showing up in a bunch of big ways, for the Bridges, and especially because he gave all of that money to her foundation itself. So Ruby, she graduates from a desegregated high school. She works as a travel agent for 15 years. In her interview, she talks a lot about her love of traveling. And so she was able to fulfill that dream of hers. And she's a parent, and now she's the chair of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, which she formed in 1999 to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences.
Yeah. She talks about how she kind of comes back to the idea of activism after sort of, and I can't, who could blame her for wanting to sort of live a somewhat normal life after all of that? She kind of set aside some of those things for a while to do this travel-related work that she just really enjoyed. But she said that at some point she decided it was important for her to come back and start telling her story. So,
well, she's so young. I mean, she has to grow up and sort of then learn about what was happening to her. You know what I mean? Like, with her age, like, she couldn't have possibly understood sort of the, everything that was happening. So it would probably be very hard to then, as an adult, kind of go back through and be like,
oh, I'm in textbooks.
Right. And just like, but also like what she represents.
Right.
So, Ruby now, and has for a while, she will do some speaking engagements, and she has even spoken with Mrs. Henry, her teacher, and she's done a couple with Robert Coles, a psychiatrist, about sort of her experience. And my dad actually got to hear Ruby speak at a reading conference many years ago, and he got me the book, and we have it at his house still. And so that was one of the reasons when we were talking about what to cover this week, Ruby popped in my head, because I remember my dad telling me about hearing her, and he said that she felt like a teacher to him, like when she was talking, like she's just so easy to learn from because of her experiences.
She's very humble about it. If you have a chance to, we'll put it in the show notes, but some of her interviews are really interesting just because of the humility that she brings to this incredibly difficult situation. It's great to hear from her in her own words.
So, not surprising, but unfortunately for all of the people who were affected in New Orleans by Hurricane Katrina, Ruby lost her family home, but it also really damaged William Frantz Elementary School where she went. And she was one of the people who played a really big role in trying to make sure that the school remained open even afterwards. So we see her still fighting for this school, right? Because she was able to learn, and even though it wasn't even the most ideal situations, like to hear Ruby talk about it, it still meant a lot to her, and it was important to her. So she did fight to make sure that the school remained open.
Yeah, it was designated on the National Register of Historic Places in 2005, which was, isn't that also the year Katrina? Yeah, so Katrina hit, and then the same year it was designated a National Historic Place, and then actually in 2014 there was a statue of Ruby unveiled in front of the school, so it's still there.
So one other thing that Ruby has this is kind of interesting, I think. In November of 2007, the Children's Museum of Indianapolis unveiled a new permanent exhibit that documented her life, and that also included the lives of other children like Anne Frank and Ryan White. And so the exhibit was called The Power of Children Making a Difference, and it was a $6 million project that they created, and it even included a recreation of Bridges' her first grade classroom, which I think would just be so cool for anyone to see. So if you've heard of Ruby Bridges, aside from, a brief maybe glossing over in a history book somewhere, you've probably seen the Norman Rockwell painting of her. It's from 1964, and it pictures Ruby going to school being escorted by at least three, I think maybe all four U.S. Marshals. So the perspective, though, is Ruby is standing at height walking, and then you can tell that she's just such a little kid because the guy is beside her. All you see are their pant legs, and like on their armband it says, U.S. Marshal. Rockwell had ended his contract with the Saturday Evening Post the previous year, so 1963, because he was frustrated that they weren't really letting him express the political and all other types of things that he wanted to portray in his art. And so he published it in January 14th, 1964, inside an issue of Look. And so actually Ruby suggested to President Barack Obama that the painting should be installed at the White House in the hallway outside the Oval. And so it did hang there from July to October of 2011. And on July 15th, 2011, Bridges met with President Obama at the White House. And while they viewed the painting, he told her that, quote, "I think it's fair to say if it hadn't been for you guys, I might not be here and we wouldn't be looking at this together."
That's pretty neat.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen the painting, it's very stirring.
I remember this painting. I think this painting was in the textbook.
It probably was, because it struck me very quickly.
Right.
That's what pops in my head. But then also, if you look at the images of her online, of her going to school surrounded by marshals, it's so stirring.
There's a way in which she looks incredibly adult.
Yeah.
For being so small. There's this picture of her like carrying this little satchel coming down the front steps, and there are these crazy huge marshal guys who look really kind of imposing all around her with their little armbands on or whatever. But she just looks like she looks like a small adult, essentially, just kind of walking down the stairs, blazing the trail.
She looks like a little boss lady. She's like, I can do this. That's fine.
She's both adorable and incredibly mature looking at the same time. So it's just look at some images of that time, because they're pretty striking.
Yeah. So I mean, she was just one of four who actually went to one of these elementary schools in New Orleans, but their stories are out there as well. But Ruby has sort of solidified, her place as a figure of this, just because, and it's not that their stories aren't important as well, but especially that she was the only Black child at this school.
Yeah.
It makes for a very, and how important is she?
Yeah.
Like when we talk about all the things happening, and I think President Obama's probably onto something when he said that, if her family wouldn't have been so determined for her to get this education, it could have been that there wasn't such a push as quick as there was to start desegregating. And it still took time, but
yeah, I think I read that the following year the school kind of more or less went back to normal with desegregated classes, so there was not this big hubbub around it. But I mean, you can attribute a lot of that progress, even though they still had so much farther to go, and we still have so much farther to go. You can attribute that progress to Ruby being courageous little 6-year-old.
Sure.
So
okay, so fill in the blank time. Okay, so last week on our fill in the blank, The question was, in what year was Memorial Day declared a national holiday by Congress? And it was 1971.
1971.
Yeah. So this week, to go with the theme, the question is this. In the 1960s, a sociologist coined the term redlining to describe the discriminatory practice of fencing off areas where banks would avoid investments based on the community demographics. So, what was the name of that sociologist?
The sociologist who coined the term redlining.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right,
Want to move on to what we learned this week?
Yep.
Yup.
What did you learn?
Oh boy,
the past 2 weeks.
I learned a lot. Yeah, I guess I learned a lot. Okay, so I was talking about this earlier, but Kate and I just finished reading this book called White Fragility. It's written by a woman named Robin DiAngelo. She's a white writer who wrote this book for a white audience, and it's about why it is so hard for white people, especially in the United States, to confront and discuss racism and their participation in it and the legacy of it and all of this. It's about why it is often so difficult to even have just a sort of basic conversation about racism and the presence of racism in this country and the enduring history of it. Why we seem to be so sensitive to it, why our feelings often get hurt by it. It takes on a lot of different issues related to specifically why white people have a hard time with it. It's a really interesting book. I think white people should go to the trouble of reading it.
Yeah.
It covers a lot, but I mean, I would say that we learned a whole bunch of different things from this book. And I guess I would say I saw a tweet going around this week that was hypothesizing that it's easier to change a mind of somebody who's reading a book. Like, it's easier to change your mind if you're reading a book rather than having a conversation. Because the nature of conversation is that you're always kind of working like this point counterpoint argument in your head in real time as you're doing it.
The book doesn't do that.
Yeah,
sure.
Conversation doesn't afford you the opportunity to sit back and really just spend time thinking and absorbing in a way where you're not trying to actively participate in a discussion. So it's anyway, we did spend some time reading this book, White Fragility, and like I said, we learned a whole bunch of stuff from it, but I kind of just picked out one of my favorite quotations from it, kind of what I was talking about earlier about objectivity, but I just want to read it as one of the things that I learned. This is the quote: "No one can be taught to treat people equitably because humans cannot be 100% objective. For example, I could lecture you for hours that it is not nice to judge, that no one likes to be judged. You wouldn't want to be judged, would you? And so on. At the end of the lecture, you would still continue to judge because it's impossible not to. We can try to examine our judgments, hold them more lightly, and so forth, but to be free of judgment, not possible. Nor can we treat everyone the same. Indeed, the person professing to treat everyone the same is stating a value that he or she holds, but the claim closes off any further reflection. Once we understand the power of implicit bias, for example, we know that we must deepen rather than close off further reflection." So that was one of my important takeaways from this book, is that when we say things like, oh, I'm colorblind, or I treat everyone the same, or this idea that we're somehow post-racial, the main takeaway from this book is sort of how can you see and confront systemic issues of racism if you claim that they don't really exist for you or that you can't see them? It's like, okay, if you can't see color, how will you see racism? Is one of the main questions from that book. So I think that for especially white people who are struggling with how to confront and deal with what is happening around us in our country, I think a lot of it for me comes down to, okay, we need to acknowledge these things. Like, even the most well-meaning progressive can fail to acknowledge things because they want to be seen as a good person. And there's this false dichotomy of good person, bad person when it comes to racism. There's this false idea that only bad people can be racist, but racism is not just a bad act done by a bad actor. It's a systemic problem with a long history, and we all participate in it unwillingly or willingly for some, but we can't escape it. It's a force that we need to identify and confront, and we have to acknowledge in ourselves our own issues before we can move forward at all to a more equitable way of living in this country. So What we learned is a little bit heavy this week, but that's what I learned. So what did you learn?
Okay, so this week, I just wanted to share a few things as a way to kind of further promote our hope in doing this episode. And so a couple of things that you can do. So trying to find ways to support Black Lives Matter, the movement, and all types of other things that have sort of popped up as part of it. There are a ton of ways to donate to a group that you feel, best represents and supports what you believe, which is important. You can sign petitions. You can contact state and local reps of the governments or agencies or whatever to demand action and justice. You can donate to those who are protesting. They might need food or water or medical supplies. And even for those who don't or can't do a monetary donation or go somewhere physically, there are I can link this in the show notes, but there are some YouTube videos right now that have been monetized so that if you can't donate financially, all you need to do is click on that link, let the video run, and it will help bring in money for these groups, for bail funds or whatever else that might need, the money to be supported right now. What I kind of want to hit on the most, though, is what I think has been one of the neatest ways to support, and especially from the side of educators. I'm in a group on Facebook called Clear the List, which is a place that teachers will post an Amazon shopping list for things that they need for their classroom, obviously because there's not enough funding in education to help support what all teachers need. So most of us, including myself, we have to make ends meet by purchasing the things ourselves. And so this group, it's huge, but what they did was they allowed for a couple of their days of posting to support teachers, and their needs, to only let people of color and Black, whoever, to post their list so that you knew that you were supporting someone, like in a minority or something like that needs, especially if we're talking about some of these districts, they're even worse off as far as funding goes. And so I went through and I found a couple of teachers and I bought some books for their classrooms through Amazon that was shipped directly to them. And so that was a really cool way, I think, for me as an educator to kind of support this movement and to support other educators especially. And so I guess what I would just ask of you is to think about, what can you do to help? And it doesn't have to be a physical thing that you go and do. It doesn't have to be a money thing that you go and give. But even reading a book like White Fragility or any of the others that have been suggested, there are tons of lists going around, you have to find a way to help yourself, I guess is how I would say it, as far as, especially as a white person, there's so much work that we can be doing to be better allies. And that can mean as neighbors or family members or teachers or whatever. There's just so much we can do, and it's really overwhelming. And it's been hard to kind of try to navigate Twitter and all these other places to see, okay, who needs the money right now and where can I help the most? And so that's going to take a little bit of research on your end. As far as what I did, I tried to support things in Ohio, obviously. That doesn't mean that you can't support things nationally either. But you can get creative in how you help people and how you become a better ally. Do your own research. Find your place in this and check your privilege and know that you have it just by being white. And then from there, try to make something out of it.
Good. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Man, gosh.
Be safe out there. Take care of yourselves. Just recognize that this is a moment where a spotlight is being shown on issues of race in this country, but these issues are still going to be ongoing after this moment passes. It feels a little different this time. It feels like there might be some progress being made that hasn't been made before, but we still have such a long way to go confronting our own shared history of racism in this country, and we want to try to encourage our listeners to do their best to contribute to a more equitable society moving forward.
And Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. The end. Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1.
We're trying to grow our audience, so please check us out at 16to1.com, all spelled out, and tell your friends about the show.
On our website, you can find links to follow us on social media, an archive of all our old episodes, and a contact form where you can get in touch.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. That is the face of a cat that's going to kill you in her sleep.